Welcome to this Good Friday service of worship, a Tenebrae service or a service of shadow. Tenebrae is a Latin word that means darkness. And so on Good Friday, we recall how Easter begins in the dark. We cannot rush past it. In fact, the Gospel of John, which is so attuned to light and dark, is careful to point out that the women came to the tomb early on Easter morning while it was still dark. On this day of all days, we know that Jesus came to shine the bright light of God's love among us, and yet we choose the darkness again and again. We remember that we have the capacity to extinguish the light of God's love, that we have within us the ability to snuff out the good gifts that God gives to this world. And so we enter the shadows of Good Friday, recognizing that they are shadows in our own lives and stories as well. Finding those shadows around us, finding those shadows among us, and perhaps finding those shadows within us. And as we prepare our hearts for worship, I want to invite you to join your pastoral staff in a responsive reading to call us together. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Bless the Lord who forgives all our sins.
God's mercy endures forever.
And this is the judgment.
That the light has come into this world.
And we loved darkness rather than light.
God is light, in whom there is no darkness at all.
For God sent the Son into the world,
not to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him.
Everyone that does evil hates the light and does not come to the light.
But all who do what is true come to the light.
Come, let us worship in spirit and in truth. As we begin to enter these shadows with Jesus, we're going to sing a song that comes from the Tenebrae community. Tenebrae is an ecumenical monastic community in central France, and their worship includes wonderful songs that repeat phrases of scripture for meditation and prayer. Phrases like this one from Jesus to us. Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray, watch and pray. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Will you remain here and keep awake?" Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray, watch and pray. Then he went a little farther. He threw himself on the ground. He prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, and yet, not what I want, but what you want." Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray, watch and pray. He came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And he went away again and prayed, saying the same words. Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray, watch and pray. once more he came. He found them sleeping. Their eyes were very heavy. They did not know what to do and what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray, watch and pray." He said, "The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand."
The shadow of betrayal. Mark 14:43 through 45. Immediately, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to Jesus at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. A reading from Frederick Buechner entitled Judas. Nobody can be sure, of course, why Judas sold Jesus out, although according to John's Gospel, he already had a reputation for dipping into the poor box from time to time, so the cash may have been part of it. If, like the other disciples, he was perennially worried about where he stood in the pecking order, he may also have been reacting to some imagined slight. Maybe Judas thought his job as treasurer to the outfit was beneath him. Another possibility is that he had gotten fed up with waiting for Jesus to take the world by storm and hoped that betraying him might force him to show his hand at last. Or maybe because nothing human is ever uncomplicated, something of all these was involved. Anyway, whatever the reasons were, the whole thing went sour for him soon enough. Slipping out of the Last Supper before the party was over, Judas led the Romans to the garden that he knew his friends were planning to adjourn to afterward, and said to lay low till he gave the signal. It was dark by the time the others showed up, and maybe for fear that he might scare them off if he used any other method, the way he showed the soldiers which was the one to jump was by kissing him. That was all he'd been paid to do. As soon as he'd done it, there was no earthly reason why he couldn't have taken off with the laundered cash and found a place to spend it. But when the time came, he wasn't in the mood. There are several versions of what he did instead, of which the most psychologically plausible seems to be that he tried to give the money back to the ones who'd given it to him, and then went out and took his own life. This time there doesn't seem to be any ambiguity about the motive. There is a tradition in the early church, however, that it was not based on despair, but on hope. If God was just, then Judas knew there was no question where he would be heading as soon as he breathed his last. Furthermore, if God was also merciful, he knew there was no question either that in the last-ditch effort to save the souls of the damned as God's Son, Jesus would be down there too. Thus, the way Judas figured it, hell might be the last chance he'd have of making it to heaven. So he wanted to get there soon. Who knows? In any case, it's a scene to conjure with. Imagine it. Once again, they met in the shadows, the two old friends, both of them a little worse for wear after all that had happened. Only this time, it was Jesus who was the one to give the kiss.
The shadow of denial.
Luke 22, 54 through 62. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." A little later, someone else, on seeing him, said, "You are also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then about an hour later, still another kept insisting, "Surely this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." At that moment, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. An excerpt from The Perfect Mirror by Barbara Brown Taylor. On Good Friday, Jesus stood at the center of the stage like a mirror in which all those around him saw themselves clearly for who they were. One way we Christians have avoided seeing our own reflections in the mirror is to pretend that this is a story about Romans and Jews. As long as they remain the villains, we are off the hook, or so we think. Unfortunately, this is not a story that happened long ago in a faraway land. Children of God are killed in every generation. This is a story that can happen anywhere at any time, and we are as likely to be the perpetrators as the victims. I doubt that many of us will end up playing Annas, Caiaphas, or Pilate, however. They may have been the ones who gave Jesus the death sentence, but a large part of him had already died before he ever got to them. The part Judas killed off, then Peter, then all those who fled. Those are the rolls with our names on them. Not the enemies, but the friends. Whenever someone famous gets in trouble, that's one of the first things the press focuses on. What do his friends do? Do they support him, or do they tell reporters that, unfortunately, they had seen trouble coming for some time? One of the worst things a friend can say is what Peter said. We weren't friends exactly. Acquaintances might be a better word. Actually, we just worked together. For the same company, I mean, not together, just near each other. My desk was near his. I don't really know him at all. What happened then goes on happening now. In the presence of his integrity, our own pretense is exposed. In the presence of his constancy, our cowardice is brought to light. In the presence of his fierce love of God and for us, our own hardness of heart is revealed. Take him out of the room and all those things become relative. I'm not that much worse than you are, nor you than I. But leave him in the room and there's no place to hide. He is the light of the world. In his presence, people either fall down to worship him or do everything they can to extinguish the light. A cross and nails are not always necessary. There are 1,000 ways to kill him, some of them as obvious as choosing where you will stand when the showdown between the weak and the strong comes along. Others of them as subtle as keeping your mouth shut when someone asks if you know him. Today, while he dies, do not turn away. make yourself look in the mirror. Today, no one gets away without being shamed by his beauty. Today, no one flees without being laid bare by his light.
The shadow of the trial. Luke 23:11-21. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him, then put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. And here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of the charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with him! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" An excerpt from What Pilate Cannot Touch by Brian Bantam. What is truth? Pilate asks in John 18. He is trying to reconcile this person he sees before him with the turmoil swirling in his city. He is trying to place Jesus in terms he can understand: kingship, power, authority. Who is this man who seems to have power, seems to have authority, and yet here he is, bound, bleeding, and seemingly despised? Jesus is the one in chains, the one who has been betrayed, the one whose friends have left him, the one who needs Pilate to save him. And yet Jesus is the one who speaks of bearing witness and truth. Jesus seems to possess all the certainty, while Pilate is the one who seems confused. Pilate plucks out a word, kingship, as a way of tethering himself as he looks from Jesus to the crowd to the Sanhedrin. But the question is resolved only in terms of who has power and who can keep it. More specifically, how Pilate can keep his power. Jesus' invocation of truth and witness is about a different kind of power. There is something in this world beyond the violence and the manipulation and the denial and the misapprehension. Something that sits lodged in our midst, pressing on our chest and not letting some of us forget who we are. There is something Pilate cannot touch, and kingship is the only word he can use to grasp it. But its power is too deep, too alive, too free to be confined in such a fragile status as king. Jesus knows his people, and his people know him. The recognition of truths that bind us to one another is ephemeral and indeterminate, and yet unrelentingly present. The truth cannot be scourged with whips or mocked with crowns of thorns and faux garments. The truth rings in a way that shivers the very ground and causes curtains to tear from heaven to earth. The truth of Good Friday is that while Pilate scurries between Jesus and the people and his little bowl of water and back again, trying desperately to hold on to the folds of papered authority, Jesus has already sunk his hands deep into the ground and grasped the roots of our lives. We are his. He is ours. God has become like us so that we might become like God. We see him and he sees us. There are things we love that Pilate cannot touch.
That shadow of mockery. Mark 15, verses 16 through 20. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again, they struck him with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Return the Cross to Golgotha by George MacLeod. I simply argue that the cross be raised again, at the center of the marketplace, as well as on the steeple of the church. I am recovering the claim that Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between two candles, but on a cross between two thieves, on a town garbage heap, at a crossroad of politics so cosmopolitan that they had to write his title in Hebrew and in Latin and in Greek. And at the kind of place where cynics talk smut, and thieves curse, and soldiers gamble, because that is where he died, and that is what he died about, and that is where Christ's own ought to be, and that is what church people ought to be about.
The shadow of the cross. Mark 15, 33 through 37. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And then Jesus gave a loud cry, and Jesus breathed his last. It's Friday, sometime on Friday, sometime between death and resurrection. Joseph claims the body. Mary and the others prepare their spices. The disciples hide under rocks and behind locked doors, and they all begin to adjust to life without him. He can't keep his promise this time. He won't make it back. It's Friday. Sometime on Friday. Sunday isn't coming, not as far as anyone can see. Death has prevailed. Fear has carried the day. Rome has won just like they always do. Promises are left broken. Hopes are laid open, and tombs are left closed. It's Friday, late Friday. You know it because it's where we spend much of our lives. It's the time when the followers of Jesus decide what his words meant to us and what his life did to us. It's when we decide what we really believe and what we are prepared to do.